Welcome to Take 5, your 5-minute inspirational message from Solid Rock Drogheda. In Luke's Gospel in chapter 18, Jesus told a parable, and it's centered around two very different people. One was a Pharisee and the other was a tax collector. Now, it's probably difficult for us to appreciate looking at this 2,000 years later, but for the people who listened to Jesus on that day just close to Jericho, there was no doubt about who was the bad guy and who was the good guy in the story. I mean, the Pharisees, I know we think of Pharisee as an insult today, but back then they were considered the good guys. The Pharisees were the people who were following God. The Pharisees were the people who were standing up to the tyrannical rule of the Roman occupation forces. And the tax collectors were the lowest of the low. I mean, it's hard for us to imagine just how much they were held in contempt. Maybe think about somebody who was an informer for the British Army in nationalist West Belfast during the Troubles, or think about somebody who was secretly working to help the Nazis in occupied France during the Second World War, and you might begin to get an idea of how hated the tax collectors were. Really, the way that we today would look at a child abuser or somebody like that, that's who Jesus is talking about. And in this story that features the lowest kind of humanity imaginable and the religious patriot that was standing up to the Romans, everyone knew one was the baddie, one was the goodie. It was the greatest contrast you could possibly have. And yet, Jesus turned things absolutely upside down. And he contrasts the pride in the heart of the Pharisee with the humility that the tax collector showed. And he said it was the tax collector that went away justified. It was a tax collector who walked away righteous in the sight of God. It's very hard for us to imagine what a shocking story, how subversive, how countercultural this story was that Jesus was telling. And I can imagine the disciples saying to one another, oh, wow, if he keeps telling stories like that, we're all going to be crucified. And then saying to themselves, well, look, at least it's just a story. Let's move on. It's just a story. Except in the very next chapter, Luke chapter 19, the story comes true, because there we read about a guy called Zacchaeus, who was the lowest of the low. He was one of these hated collaborators with the Romans, one of these tax collectors that made his living fleecing ordinary, common working people. And this man climbed a tree to see Jesus and basically gave his life to Jesus, was transformed, was welcomed into the fellowship of Jesus' disciples. And the unimaginable story now became an unimaginable reality. But something that we often miss in this story, and I know all kids in Sunday school know about the little wee little man in the tree, but Zacchaeus, his name meant pure. That's what the name Zacchaeus meant, pure. Pure in the sight of God. You know what? That name must have caused much sniggering as he went about his business as a tax collector. How could anyone be less suited to the name that they carried as Zacchaeus being named pure? And yet, what that tells us is for him to receive that name, at one time somebody had high hopes for Zacchaeus. His parents had high hopes for him, not just that he would be a successful person, not just that he would be a wealthy person or even a happy person, but that he would be a pure person. And instead, he had gone down a life's path that must have been the bitterest disappointment to the parents who had bestowed upon him this name of purity. And then, in one day, Jesus didn't just turn a story on its head. Jesus turned a man's life upside down, and Zacchaeus became pure in the sight of God, just like the tax collector in the story. You know, Jesus has a wonderful way of turning our lives upside down, and actually our lives are already upside down. Jesus is putting us the right way up again. But he also has a wonderful way of fulfilling broken and lost dreams and hopes that seemed to be shattered and gone forever. And that's what Jesus did with Zacchaeus. I pray that today you will know the transforming power of Jesus to turn your life upside down and to make dead dreams live again in Jesus' name. Please join us again tomorrow for another Take 5, your 5-minute inspirational message from Solid Rock Drogheda.